human rights is the values system that you need to evaluate design choice. If it's this design over this design, maybe the tiebreaker should be how is this going to affect end users, or how is this going to implicate human rights? One thing I like to say about the Fediverse is like, you don't have to worry about what other people are doing on the Fediverse, right? That's the beauty of the interoperability and of being able to move throughout spaces if it doesn't suit you. Like maybe there's a version of the Fediverse or a space where it's a lot more moderated, or it's language specific, or it's topic specific. You can go elsewhere, and you don't have to worry about what those other folks are doing. It's fine.
I am incredibly excited to have Mallory Knodel on Revolution.Social. She, like myself and a bunch of other technologists, has her roots in indie media 20 years ago as an activist, part of the May 1st collective, but has also been the CTO of CDT and recently the executive director of the Social Web Foundation. Welcome.
Thank you. So excited to be here too.
There's this thread of people who have been trying to figure out how to use the internet for social change and how to use the technology we're building and the media we create for a long time, and you're part of that. Before this, you were talking about hanging out at the ABC No Rio squat in New York in their sort of tech center. I'm wondering if you could talk about that time and how you came from it, and how this sort of idea of using the internet for social change went from this super fringe thing to the social media we have today.
I mean, for me, the journey is really just a function of time. Like I got a degree in physics and math and was an activist, and those felt like very separate worlds until I realized that my education, I was doing a bunch of programming and working with computers, and that could be useful to activism, because that was not always the case. And so once I figured that out, it was like, okay, great. This is now the worlds have merged. And so that was around the time when I lived in New York. So I was teaching high school physics in New York City, and then met folks at May 1st, joined up with them. We were doing U.S. Social Forum, World Social Forum. And so it just made sense. It clicked. It was like, okay, we're doing work in service of social movements. We're providing tech, we're providing comms, like that.
Yeah, I mean, I felt the same thing. Like I had been an activist with friends in Earth First doing blockades and direct action and things like that. But my heart was in computers. I studied physics for my undergraduate degree, and which I never finished. But it felt like two wildly different worlds of like, here's this activist world where we're talking about a new world is possible and prefiguring everything else. And then here's the technology that I love and what I like to do with. And the movement that both of us were involved in was trying to figure out how to combine that. How do we provide or create new technology for these social movements?
Exactly. And I think what happened also is everyone else figured that out too, because then you had these really big platforms coming up in the 2000s that you could so easily deploy a website, deploy a microblog, and get your message out there and hashtag it. And that was just so compelling, so easy. And we were still trying to build our own version of that. We were trying to popularize the idea that we still need to own it. We want to, just like our email that we were really trying to get everybody to use instead of big tech alternatives. So I think that was part of the story as well, is that, at some point it got democratized so well that it wasn't anymore that folks were using stuff that indie media folks had built or that the various collectives you mentioned had built. They were using the corporate platforms, which is totally fine in the end.
Well, it is fine. It isn't fine. I mean, it actually gets into the work we're doing now with protocols, because at the time in 2003, 2004, 2006, that time, we had a discussion about how it wasn't enough just to democratize the means of communication, but you had to democratize the technology and who owned it, how you control it.
That's it.
And what happened with Web 2.0 is it became very easy to have a voice on other people's platforms.
That's it.
It became very easy to create a podcast that you hosted somewhere else, to post tweets, to use a blog platform. And some open source tools emerged out of that. WordPress emerged out of it. Podcasting remained remarkably open, but a lot of them ended up being closed. They're very community oriented, but Flickr, for example, or what became Twitter, Instagram, where we got the innovation of that activist community, but not
ownership.
The community ownership.
Yes, I think the ownership is the key thing. And we are kind of getting this chance again. So this is why I kind of dropped everything to help launch the Social Web Foundation, because it seemed like we had the protocol, or the protocols, plural, and that was the thing that was going to unlock interoperability that could really foster an ecosystem that is plural and that could have corporate owners, but also cooperative owners and things like that. So it just felt like the right time, basically the time we'd been waiting for all of this time to just be able to make it our own again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that before Elon took over Twitter, we had this thing where we'd be like, we should use a protocol. We should have community control. We should do alternatives. It's problematic that 4 guys get to decide what speech is available on the internet. And everybody would be like, oh yeah, but how are you going to get anyone to choose? Or why would you look alternatives? Or those things will never work, or they'll never scale. And then, even though the community had been building these tools for years and years and years, it's sort of to see a platform that had been trying to do the good thing. Twitter, which tried to do the right thing, when it gets taken over, then it got people's attention.
Yeah. And I think that's the message. I think everybody realized that the broader discourse understood it, but I'm talking especially in the smaller circles of, digital human rights organizations and so on, really understood that everything that they would work so hard for from a direct corporate advocacy perspective, raising alarm bells about genocide in this corner of the world, or features over here that were harming women at scale, or, they could just be so easily undone from the top down of a huge corporate. Nothing was durable at all. And I think that also, you definitely have, mass adoption, but then you have the people really close to, but still outside from these corporates that just didn't believe in what they were doing anymore.
Yep.
And still, I don't think we've necessarily resolved it. I don't think people are necessarily satisfied with the current options, even though a lot of people went to Blue Sky. I still think that that's being developed. We have to convince people that they're not wrong to believe that we can change behavior and that we just have the imagination that it's possible. I think it's hard, but Elon Musk gave us a little bit of imagination that it would be possible, right?
Yeah, I mean, the irony is that Twitter funded Blue Sky before that.
That's right.
As a platform that it was going to use. But so much of the social web actually goes back to an earlier era where Evan Podromo and a bunch of open source activists,
Christine Lemmer-Weber.
Christine Weber and a bunch of other people, they saw Twitter's first time they shut down the API. So Twitter, from 2006 to 2012, was this very open, freewheeling place, and they let anybody build apps, and you could use Twitter, and you never went to twitter.com. You used it on whatever app, and the power rested with those apps. And then Twitter decided that their business model was advertising, and that they needed to be competitive, and they needed to create moats, and they cut off all these apps. Right. And that's where the Fediverse comes from. That's where these first sort of technology activists say, can we build a protocol-based open alternative?
ActivityPub is the one you're talking about. So that is what powers Mastodon, WordPress integration, Ghost, Threads also uses it. There's a dozen or so that have all adopted it. But it was standardized in the World Wide Web Consortium, and it's still being extended. The protocol is there. There's effectively 2 pieces to it. One is just data formats, which is really helpful. That's activity streams. And then ActivityPub on top of it is how you get the data from server to server. Yeah.
And the irony is that the big social platforms, Twitter and Facebook and all of those, they participated in the early development of these standards. Facebook at one point supported activity streams almost 20 years ago now. And now they're back to supporting it again with Threads. And the idea behind it is that you, instead of having a single server that a corporation owns, you can install it and run it yourself.
Exactly.
And that this server is in charge of your username and your content and your trust and safety moderation rules, and is also your local community around people you talk to first.
Yes, that's true. And a lot of the examples we have today are like that. But it doesn't have to be, because these things are so interoperable that you could actually put different layers to this. So you could have content moderation, for example, that works across a bunch of different platforms, across a bunch of different servers as a service, say. And it would be easier to build something like that because it would be widely adopted by multiple different platforms. Whereas what happens in sort of walled garden social media, it's up to them, right?
Yeah.
And they build their own content moderation. You can't scrutinize it, and it's only for that. Others like Thorn have built things that are supposed to integrate with multiple platforms, but you have to convince really big tech companies to take on your tech. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But in ActivityPub or in Fediverse or in these open protocols, you could build something and then make it available, and it's more likely more people will adopt it. So that, just to say, I think there's some promise there of creating different kinds. It's not just, you have ActivityPub platforms that then have federated server architecture.
Yes.
You can also have different kinds of services integrating with one another, because that's what open protocols allow.
There's this idea that you have all content moderation or no content moderation, that, free speech absolutists, Twitter's apocryphal AMAC, I think, was the lawyer who said the free speech wing of the free speech party. And it's Twitter's version of Google's don't be evil. It's like this statement that sounded great when they were a young little company and then came back to bite them when you realize that content moderation is incredibly difficult.
Gosh.
And incredibly contextual. And what makes sense in Burma does not make sense in Iceland, does not make sense what is acceptable in the Black American community is different than other communities. And the same words, the same actions, the same behavior have different meaning. And that idea of sharing or composable moderation or opening it up, that was the original idea behind Blue Sky, which was Twitter has an impossible moderation problem.
Yeah. Oh, it's so difficult. And I would say there's kind of a lot of different versions of content moderation. There's definitely is this speech or is this just satire? Those are actually really hard, and there's so much nuance, and you can't AI any of that, But then there's stuff on the spectrum of really obvious, are there 1,000 accounts on one server that do nothing but send shitty phishing links? That's, you can metadata that away, right? There's a lot of that, right? That you just immediately turn that off. You don't interact with those things. And it's difficult. But one thing I like to say about the Fediverse is you don't have to worry about what other people are doing on the Fediverse, right? That's the beauty of the interoperability and of being able to move throughout spaces if it doesn't suit you. Maybe there's a version of the Fediverse or space where it's a lot more moderated. Or it's language specific, or it's topic specific. You can go elsewhere, and you don't have to worry about what those other folks are doing. It's fine.
And even the space that people think is the least moderated space on the internet, 4chan.
Right.
4chan has unmoderated spaces, but they also have boards that are quite heavily moderated. My kids are queer teenagers, and they're hanging out on these queer 4chan boards that have heavy moderation.
Sure.
And that blows people's minds. But it's a space where people could set their own rules.
That's right.
And in this case, these teenagers, they wanted to set rules that let them say, by and for queer people to say edgy shit that would upset older queer people. Sure. And people who wanted respectability. They wanted to have that rough and tumble space. Yep. But if it were even connected to the Fediverse, which is not, but if it were, you could then say, here are the boundaries by which we're allowing you to have this conversation, and here's the boundaries which we're not. And in traditional corporate platforms, we don't have that. We have this ever-expanding list of rules that's supposed to apply to everyone.
For everyone, all the time, everywhere. And it just doesn't have to be that way. And probably shouldn't, right? I think we have a term for, how advertising is targeted or contextual. I think what we're talking about is contextual content moderation. It's we're trying to create a context. We're trying to make sure that the people in this group know why they're here and that we're staying on topic. And anyone who's ever used Reddit or Lemmy or whatever understands this. Yeah. You're there for a specific reason. It's okay to remind people that there's that reason, right? That happens all the time on my parent group chat at the school. It's this is for school stuff, but thank you for letting us know about your art show. Just keep it to school topics.
And so much of the time when these things come up, it is not I'm being censored. It's about having a way in which you could define what are the topics and how do they happen and how do they work.
So one thing that's also been true of my entire time in this space is that I'm a feminist. I started out as a feminist activist. That's what when I was a physicist and a mathematician, I was also doing a lot of feminist activism. And that politics has carried me all the way through. And the reason is it works really well in tech. I'm a firm believer in this because it has essentially two modes. On top of the general awesomeness of power analysis that feminism brings to the table, it's doing two things. It's creating a safe space and it's challenging the status quo. And that safe space is like what we're talking about now, like contextual content moderation. It's also the alternatives. So the tactic to create an alternative that's ours, that's that tactic in motion. And it works really well. I think a lot of feminist spaces, online and offline, right, have given us some great safe spaces, some great alternatives. And so that's why I work on that. And then challenging the status quo, I think you just have to read the room. It's just not a great time to be challenging huge power right now. Yeah. I mean, we tried that in earnest. I worked for, Center for Democracy and Technology. I worked for Article 19. A lot of my colleagues and me included were in the business of direct corporate advocacy to try to get platforms to do it the right way, to be good, to help also governments regulate them properly. And we had the best possible conditions for that so far. And now we're at an all-time low.
And we got this moment where we had this overwhelming set of social movements, an overwhelming set of people in the streets, and workers in all these tech companies rising up.
That's right.
Cory Doctorow talks about the walkouts that happened at Google.
Totally.
And they were quite afraid that the workers would rebel. And so they implemented all of these reforms. Right. And then the pendulum swings the other way and they get a government in power in the United States and other places in the world that doesn't care about those things. And like the facade falls off immediately. Mm-hmm. Like it wasn't durable social change.
No, it wasn't. And my heart was never in it. I mean, I definitely understood that, I'll still go to UN meetings and work on global standards and things like that because they are powerful spaces that can affect great change. So that's really important. But I just never really wanted to put all my time into making these big corporate platforms better. I understood the harm reduction and it was there for it, but I've always just wanted to build alternatives. And so that's kind of why, I worked on the social web at this time. It just seemed like we aren't going to be very good at challenging power right now. It's just not, it's not going to be effective for external reasons. Let's put more effort into the alternative tactic.
There is this question. Do you work inside the institutions? Do you lobby the institutions, or do you work to build alternatives? And the world of these social protocols, this social media that's outside of corporate control, is quite literally saying that we need to build this other alternative. And in your work, the Social Web Foundation structures as being a kind of institutional body to help all of these protocols, to help the Fediverse. I wonder if you could talk about that, because the Fediverse has no central organization.
Right.
There's no business, there's no foundation, there's no one founder of it. There's, it has no free software's benevolent dictator. There's no big funder behind it. Mastodon is the most famous one, but it's just this German hacker who just built it.
We would never want to be the central authority. We're not doing that. But I think some facilitation is needed. We want to make sure it thrives. And I think there's some big power plays to offset. There's, a lot of users coming in from threads in theory. We would hope to attract some money to support it, TBD. No, but I think that there are we're taking three real different tactics there. So the first is protocols. Evan and I are both protocol people. He did a lot of W3C. I did a bit of that, but I'm mostly IETF. We understand the utility of having protocols.
And W3C and IETF, for folks who are less technical, those are international standards bodies for the internet. The World Wide Web Consortium and the Internet Engineering Task Force, they define how the internet and the web works.
Exactly. And having the protocols is a low layer issue. It's not building apps or anything. It's just how do these things talk to each other? Having that in place is really important. And they're not static. ActivityPub needs to be extended. AT Proto needs to be extended. There's work there. That's one thing we're good at. The other one is we've managed to convene quite a lot of the implementers. So we would invite and like to have more folks from the AT Proto side, but we have about a dozen or so ActivityPub platforms that have all implemented ActivityPub in one way or another. There's a browser there, there's apps there, and that piece is really important because we were talking about how we have the protocol.
Yep.
And the apps are left to implementation, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be coordinating. That doesn't mean that all is done with the protocol. You need to make sure that the posts actually render properly, that people could migrate their account from one to another, which is the promise. And all that actually requires a little bit of working together.
Yeah. It's very similar to the nonprofit that I set up in May of this year and other stuff, which does the same thing for the Nostr community, where we got a grant and we set up some funds and we are strategically investing money in the conferences and in the developers and in the parts of the technology stack and in bridging between these different protocols, because there's this idea that, are you a Blue Sky person, or are you a Mastodon person, or are you a Nostr person, or are you just still on Twitter, or are you on Threads? And the thing that I find fascinating is, even though the users seem to have this sort of intense sectarian fighting, the protocol people, the engineers, the developers behind them, we're all working on the same, we're all part of Team Open.
Exactly. And I love it because we're trying to solve the same problems, but from different angles.
Yeah.
And I think it really does result in better tech at the end of the day. And so there is a lot of coordination. So we're trying to do that protocols, we're trying to do it in the apps. And then the last one is community. Yep. And that's really where I'm excited, because I want to go back to where we have robust social movement, and that media, it's supported by media, it's supported by free expression, it's democratized. And so as we're building the protocol, as we're extending the protocols, as we're building the platforms, can we not think about these things after the fact? Can we really think and design them with social movements in mind? Because those are in marginalized communities, right? Because those are, if you design for those communities and those use cases, you will make it better for everyone, right? Rather than thinking of, well, let's design it for the easiest possible case, like folks living in the Bay Area or in New York or something. Yeah. And then everyone else is invited to come along, and we'll tweak the way these things work to adjust for multiple languages, or, I just feel like
the base is San Francisco, and everybody else is a variation on that.
Exactly. Let's do it in the inverse, an opposite way. Let's build it for the hard cases. Let's build it for the change we really want to make. And then we get those benefits for everyone else implicitly.
When I interviewed Tony Sebelbein, the CEO of Medium, Tony said the way he got healthier communication on Medium was he put people in charge of editing content. Like, they have editors. But they went after transphobic content, because getting rid of the transphobes got rid of that nucleus of toxic behavior, and everything else
cleared up
once they got rid of the anti-trans stuff, because it was this magnet that was pulling it all in. And so if you get that away and you say this behavior isn't acceptable and we need to think about it, it's really important. Now, this brings up something that I know that you've done, which is you went to the IETF and you advocated for them considering the human rights implications of these standards, which was a major innovation, because before that, there was this idea that internet standards were just about the technology.
Totally.
It was just about what technology works. So I'm wondering if you could talk about where the idea came from for the human rights evaluation, and what you did, and how that worked.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. I mean, the IETF is radically market driven, right? They really want to be, they're consensus driven, but they imagine that
it's like this weird ass thing. IETF has this motto, which is, we reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code. They have this thing where they use consensus and they wave their little fingers and stuff. And it's this sort of simultaneously autistic, nerdy, hippie, corporate, technological body that defines how the internet works, with lots of idealistic people, but also pretending that the technology didn't have societal implications.
It's the right place to have started this work. Yeah. There's a lot of standards development organizations out there. The IETF was a really good choice because they were radical in thinking that they could have a standards body that's fully open, that has no membership, and just depends on if you've, registered on a mailman list. And sometimes you show up to meetings, and that constituted
But
the
they make it
standards
so that you don't have
development.
to show up in person. You can participate
Exactly.
remotely.
Yeah.
They have this idea of radical participation. And so many other standards bodies are either controlled by governments or controlled by
Precisely.
corporate coalition, like they're consortiums. The W3C is a corporate consortium.
It's a pay to play, just
Yeah.
like the 3GPP, which is
Yeah.
mobile telecom operators. And the ITU is states only, so that's a whole thing. So it was, out of all of them, the best pick to start this. But there was resistance because there was this belief that, hey, we are radical. We're already doing things in the best possible way because we're just open. But that was a fallacy of open for a long time,
Yeah.
right? That you could just be open and that was enough. And yeah, feminists were like, nope, that's actually not enough. You have to curate, you have to moderate, like these things matter. So we went to the IETF. This is me, Niels ten Uver, who was running Article 19's digital program. I was at the Association for Progressive Communications when we put out a report written by a couple people about why human rights organizations should pay attention to the IETF. This is
Yeah.
like 2011, 2012. I mean, most people didn't know what that was. And it sparked a chain of events where I started getting involved in standards. My first meeting was like 2014. And eventually, we were able to charter this research group called the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group that I still co-chair today. So it's a research group of the IETF. So it's technically the Internet Research Task Force, not
Yeah.
IETF, but they co-locate their meetings
Yeah.
and it's all the same folks.
ICANN, who does the domain names, is part of this same sort of weird network of internet governance
Yeah,
bodies.
ICANN is another place where we also had a cross-community working party on human rights because they're also pretty open and you just have to subscribe to mailing lists and their meetings are free. You do have to register for IETF meetings and it can get a little expensive, but ICANN is totally open. They mint money, so that is why. Anyway, so we were trying to talk about how human rights is the values system that you need to evaluate design choice. If it's this design over this design, maybe the tiebreaker should be how is this going to affect end users or how is this going to implicate human rights? And you can do that for a lot of different things, even that wouldn't seem to be they are bare protocols. They don't necessarily seem to have values involved, but they do at the end of the day. And obviously this was put into very stark relief in 2013 with the Snowden Revelations. Yes. And the IETF community was furious after that because you had people from NSA, GCHQ, DOD that had been participating in the IETF.
That's the thing. So like Snowden's revelations to most people is just like the government is spying on us.
Yeah, they were abusing the internet for spying. And
but they were working to change the protocols, change the standards of how the internet to work, to allow them to spy on people.
I think that felt like such a betrayal, even though they were like sitting around the table, right? Like I would go to IETF meetings still today. Sometimes you wind up sitting next to somebody from the NSA. They know a lot about cryptography. They're very smart. You want them in the room. But I think the betrayal came when realizing that this whole global network they built had just been used as a surveillance machine.
Oh my God, the spy agencies weren't behaving, honestly.
Gasp. Yeah. So, but they put out this really important RFC and it says pervasive monitoring is an attack on the network. That was excellent. And it just sparked a ton of protocol development to both secure protocols. So existing protocols, new versions of the protocols which were more secure, and a ton of work around privacy. So a lot more protocols and a lot more new protocols that had privacy embedded. So we weren't just talking about privacy in our human rights group. We were also talking about free association, free expression. So we do a ton of work on censorship, both measuring the problem and trying to seed alternatives. I think there's some future work there for sure that people are talking about now, which is, can we better coordinate among circumvention techniques, not just VPNs, but, in-service circumvention, all that, to better create, the conditions for, protocols that can't be abused and used for surveillance, like fewer signals, please, in those protocol designs, and also just ways that they could better work together so you could, change your strategy, depending on the network conditions. And anyway, it's exciting work. But I would say that, we made some progress in the IETF. We made some progress in ICANN. W3C was a bit harder because around that time, everybody was really mad about DRM
Yeah, I remember my friend Harry Halpin actually was the crypto lead at the W3C, and he quit.
He left. That's right.
He literally quit in protest because they were adopting DRM.
Yeah, and EFF left the consortium. CDT stayed. We were one of the only civil society organizations left. Everyone else was a browser or an ad tech.
It was entirely an industry.
It was, yeah. And more or less like kind of still is, but they have, there's a great spec they have out now about privacy principles for the web. They have been really on board with, from a top-down values level, talk about human rights, talking about the values there. I'm still chairing work at the IETF, but worked with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights.
Yeah.
The human rights community at some point really got it. This was a few years ago. They brought us all to Geneva in the room with the ceiling that's always in all the pictures.
Yeah.
And we sat in front of states for about 8 hours talking about how we were getting this work done. And so now the UN is really into it. They want human rights organizations to get involved in standards. They want them to have the capacity and the competency to be able to come to standards bodies. Funding conditions notwithstanding, it's been great to see that. So they're on a mission to basically get all of the global standards bodies to adopt some kind of process in the bodies themselves so that these conversations can happen. So the ITU is really interested in doing something. They're right across the street from the OHCHR.
Yeah.
ISO is really excited about it. The IEEE has been doing some great work on it. Their big publication that seeded their P7000 series on AI. This was maybe 2018. The first principle in that book was respect for human rights.
Yeah.
We had some wins.
Yep.
Yeah, it's been helpful.
The standards work is so thankless. It is so tedious.
Oh my God.
And it is so pedantic. And it takes so many years from those rules and those details of those standards until you get applications you can see.
That's right. Try telling this story to funders, right?
Yeah.
Like picture this 10 years ago. Now it's a little easier because we've got some champions in that space. But 10 years ago, trying to explain to a funder like why they needed to pay for us to travel around the world 6 times a year in random cities for weeks at a time and basically do nothing. Because there's no output. I've penned some internet drafts, but mostly I'm commenting on other people's drafts, and it's in a mailing list. It was so hard to tell stories. We had to find stories to just tell over and over again.
The big tech companies know this. I mean, the big tech companies are founded by engineers who understand how the internet works. And so they send people who are standards people to all of these organizations, and these people, they actually are all really nice and well-meaning.
Of course.
But they are going to try and tweak the internet standards so that the ball rolls downhill towards Google's and towards, Amazon and AWS and towards Apple and all of these big tech companies. They make it work for them. But just like the way the NSA and GCHQ participated, they're never explicit about the reason this detail or this word or this thing or another ends up helping their organization.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we have things like intellectual property disclosures, but you're talking on a much more fine-grained level, like I'm going to fight you over this bit.
Yeah.
Right? And it's because I have some kind of hook in my, in my libraries or whatever, and I really need that. So yeah, I think that's absolutely true. So part of it is watchdogging, no question. Part of it is proactive design. We want to actually articulate what we want rather than be reactive. But reacting is good. And I think also this is something that really, really helped when I was talking about the sort of synergy I had with my colleagues in trying to challenge power and trying to, the direct corporate advocacy. Because if you're a lawyer or a human rights advocate in most of these organizations, you're talking to PR people from companies. I was talking to engineers. We could get so much faster responses from the folks who showed up to the IETF and the W3C and the ITU. It was a couple conversations. And as long as you could convince the engineers that the thing that you really needed them to think about was worth doing, it effectively just happened. Like they weren't pre-trained to just be a fence for the company, right? Which is I think a lot of what the advocacy looks like for a lot of digital human rights organizations.
And I think that there is something to be said for the fact that all of the engineers, all of the employers in those companies that make up the industry are affected by the culture around them.
Sure.
Like EFF is incredibly popular among the developers and the product people and the designers at all of these companies.
Sure.
And the ideological framing of what everyone is doing is shaped by essentially a progressive agenda. We have this idea, and we hear in the news, the sort of right-wing tech oligarchs. And there is like a teeny little bit of a sort of very wealthy VCs and investors and some of the executives of these companies who are advocating for a kind of authoritarian right-wing politics. It's depressing because they claimed they were libertarians and then they got the state and they were like, ooh, look at this. But below them, you have the vast majority of the people doing the work who are values aligned. And they don't see themselves as activists, but they agree with the agenda. The work you've done is like, how do you connect to them on that level? How do you convince them to design an internet that is pro-human rights?
That's right.
An internet that when a government in Nepal or Madagascar or Uganda wants to shut down the internet, your phones keep working.
Yeah. I think it's important to also, as advocates, drill down to our argument and be persuasive. And being in a technical space, you have no choice. You cannot just fluff your way through some argument. You need to break it into its constituent parts, be persuasive, present your alternative, or you've not made a change. And I think in some places, advocates, activists, we're kind of just used to grandstanding and trying to persuade on a moral level, right? This is very detailed persuasion. I think it's really helpful. It's taught me over the years so much about the constraints that everyone operates under. For a while, I was in the Freedom Online Coalition as an advisor and chaired that advisory board for a long time. And this isn't technical, but governments were involved in that. They were involved in earnest. So these are ministries of foreign affairs and the State Department. They're not, defense agencies or whatever, but like getting an understanding also during the Snowden Revelations, by the way, that happened then, understanding how they too are often as individuals very value aligned. They're there in the first place because they care about human rights. What the assignment is to figure out a common language that can be persuasive, not just to them, but for them, so they can take that into their context and work with it.
And work it within the institutions that have all sorts of power dynamics and things like that.
Exactly.
One of the reasons why I think both of us advocate for the social web, advocate for open protocols, advocate for our social media not being held by a single set of corporations is because those institutional things matter, because we have institutional constraints, because we have these pressures. And it is not about putting a good person in a position of power.
Right. Yeah, that can't be the goal. If the goal is get people from the top to do the right thing now, later you're going to lose, right? Or there's the potential to lose. I think we have to really design these things more durably.
As problematic to some folks as like Jack Dorsey is, he is someone who fundamentally believes in progressive values. Goldman, the COO of Twitter, went from there to work in Obama's White House. He fundamentally believed in a whole set of progressive values and yet created an institution which platformed Donald Trump, which had incentives that said that they couldn't delete his account because of the market dynamics, because of where the shareholders would have had a revolt, because Twitter needed to maximize its attention on the news. It didn't matter that someone like Goldman had absolutely impeccable progressive democratic values because of the institutional constraints. And so the solution is we build a different physics of institutions.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a really important call to action, is that we need to keep proliferating, because it also serves as iterating. Yeah. Like, it's also fine that we've gotten this wrong a few times. Yeah. It just started, right? Yeah. And I'm so excited. I think this is such an exciting time to be thinking about these things from this perspective, from the vantage point of global standards, from the vantage point of creating massive alternatives. I think the biggest just missing piece that has happened in 2025 isn't the massive political loss, which I think is important. It's actually the funding loss. We've always been underfunded. This is part of the reason why I think the work that we were doing in the early 2000s didn't quite turn, like the story didn't get told in a way that it could have done.
The reason all of the social media innovation that was created by a bunch of anarchist street activists, the reason we lost it and the reason it got handed over with VCs is because we never figured out the funding system ourselves.
Right.
Like, we never figured out how to pay ourselves, how to pay for servers, how to eventually fund the media creators.
Right.
And so the market realized we had created something of tremendous value.
Of course.
And went in there and enclosed that commons because we didn't build any defenses around it.
That's right. And we didn't have philanthropy helping. They did not get it. They get it now. Yeah. Bless them. All of them are super on it now. But then there was no convincing a Ford Foundation or an OSF that they needed to put money into building CRMs or, it just wasn't happening. They didn't understand the through line. They were funding social movements, but also the social movements didn't quite get what we were doing either. There was just a kind of misconnections for many years.
And the building of technology is quite hard, and you do it in such a different way than the way nonprofits are funded that, I remember recommending the foundations not fund this stuff because they don't have any way to understand which are the projects to make bets on.
That's absolutely true, actually. I think there was a lot of questionable stuff happening at the time, and how do you tell the difference? We didn't have the relationships. We also didn't have, I think, the diversity of experience, at least. There was a lot of monoculture involved, so that's also difficult to imagine funding when the alternative would be pumping more money into social movements. But I think that said is one of the ways to tell this story is how the technology is there, the politics are there. It's totally anemic from a sustainability perspective. And what the 2025 funding crisis is a crucible, I think, potentially to really build more of this stuff with greater constraints. But at some point, I think, we might risk what happened, 20 years ago, which is that the cool stuff we could have all made just doesn't get built because people burn out.
And I think that most people who don't work in the space don't realize that a huge percentage of human rights tech, a huge percentage of free speech tech was funded indirectly by the U.S. State Department, by other parts of the U.S. government. That's where Signal got its money for years and years and years. That's where Tor got tons of its money, the Guardian Project and dozens of other projects. And they got that money because the people in the State Department and the U.S. government saw a free and open internet as advancing their own needs. And, ironically enough, the activists building those tech were just as likely to use it inside the United States as activism and inside the West. But there was an alliance. There was an idea that Western democracy worked best when you had privacy, when you had encryption, when you had this human rights tech. And the first Trump administration didn't kill the funding of it. It was only the most recent stuff that happened with Doge that all of that funding got cut. And we don't have an answer to that yet.
That's right. Yeah, we don't, I would say. But we did get a hint of it in Trump 1. Steve Bannon tried to go after the Open Technology Fund,
yes.
You remember, and they managed to freeze the bank account for less than a year, maybe 6 months. But it really disrupted people and spooked them the first time. But I don't think there was enough fear because now we're in the situation where we're still trying to figure it out. So I think that having open ecosystem that has some sustainability built in is certainly a promise, but it could also just be a drain rather than a boon. I think we do need to figure out some kind of funding model. Maybe that's something the Social Web Foundation imagines that it might be able to do at some point is if there's a model out there, we would try to figure it out and try to lift all boats with that. But it really remains to be seen. I think there's other maybe models that are more promising, like some other projects I'm getting involved in, on various boards where we need to think about fee for service instead of, get grant funding and then provide services for free. You just have to kind of reverse that cycle somehow.
When you think of a commons isn't a thing that does not have economic activity. there are businesses that exist on the commons. Here we are in Spain, like the water systems have historically for 1,000 years been run as a commons by which the farmers get together and come to agreement on how to handle the dams and who gets much water because there's a scarcity of water. Good open source communities, Ruby on Rails and Python and Perl and WordPress and all of these others, they exist not just because people are sort of randomly volunteering their time, but because many small and large businesses depend on that common technology pool and invest in it to be able to take out. And so one of the tricky parts that we have with social media is we have an extractive model we don't want, advertising and like surveillance capitalism and things like that. And we have hints of a better model, but we don't have that yet figured out. We have all of these Fediverse servers where people do volunteer labor and they're not collecting enough money to pay for the servers. They're not paying for the moderators. You have Blue Sky, which is quite open and is absolutely on the team of openness, but in order to grow has taken VC funding. You have Farcaster, which got really into VC money with A16Z and ended up creating this overly economic system with this casino thing. And you have the Nostr protocol that is predominantly funded by grants from Jack Dorsey, who also was the reason that Blue Sky got funded. And he's not controlling it, but it is not sustainable if that goes away.
I agree. I feel like we need really the key here is to connect to content creation because that's also suffering. Content creation publishers have also really taken a hit through this extractive model. So there's no reason why I think we shouldn't really see those as common problems and try to correct that really directly, right? How do you subscribe? How do you micropay for one article or, tip your content creators? I think that might be the virtual circle, but we haven't had the opportunity to, I think, test that out all the way. But that's just a hunch because I feel like the common problem is there, and that's actually better. I like to cut out intermediaries whenever possible, right? If you're bringing a relationship between a consumer and a creator closer together by allowing that transaction to transpire, and really your social media substrate is just to bring those relationships to one another, I think that's great.
Well, and that was the promise of Substack. The promise of Substack was this idea that Substack was going to come in and you own your audience, you own your payments, you own your relationships. And then Substack realized that they wanted to help people build their audiences and they wanted to cross promote and they want to do these things. And so they built an app and you can post, tweet like things and you can post media and everything else. And those things don't leave if you leave.
That's right. It's closed.
And
exactly.
Then they said, well, okay, well, just in the app, you should be able to do subscriptions. Now the app subscription is held by a relationship between Apple and Substack. And if the author leaves, they lose that subscriber. So, it's quite tricky that Substack didn't have to say they were betraying their users because they could say, well, the only way we can do this is if, it's Apple's fault.
Right. Yeah. But meanwhile, there's Ghost. And, Ghost is the version of Substack that we need and want. And it's running ActivityPub. And it is, it's really pared down version of WordPress where, when you're publishing and you're sending your newsletter, you're also posting to the open social web, and the comments and the likes and the reposts could ostensibly help boost the original content rather than thinking also of social media as a space that duplicates or replicates the content published elsewhere. I think John O'Nolan from Ghost has an awesome talk about how the promise is distribution and publication in the same platform.
And Ghost is a great example of an open source project that is also a sustainable business that builds a larger ecosystem around it.
Exactly. That should be what we're aiming for in terms of the economic model, right? It's like you use this for a business and that then feeds back in. So they're a member of Social Web Foundation. I use them. Big fan. There could be a lot more of those.
We need a larger ecosystem, and we need to realize that all of these protocols, all of these projects, it isn't one of them winning or another.
That's right.
It's, do we have a social media ecosystem that looks more like podcasting, which is the
Open.
social media that's open.
Yeah.
Like
So
there's no
open.
one company that controls podcasting. You don't need to get
great.
permissions. You don't have your podcast taken away from you.
Yeah.
Maybe Apple could block it from there, or maybe, Spotify could block it.
Yeah.
But they're not deleting your name. They're not deleting your account, your follower recommendation, like all of those things. And to me, that's the example of where we should go. And there are many podcasting apps. There are many different services that people could use. And with video, with photos, with short and long form text, with anything that's emerging in the future, with all of the AI stuff that's coming, how do we build that open thing? And how do we realize that the victory is in if we do it all together and not building something that Meta ends up controlling it? And, Meta is this company that flirts with open
Right.
over time. Like, are they gonna keep threads open enough?
Right.
Earlier this year, I launched this like social media bill of rights, and the idea was that how do we condense down what we should be demanding? We should demand ownership of your name and your followers.
For sure.
We should demand algorithmic control and transparency. There are algorithms, but can you see who's doing them? We should demand the right to exit. So can you leave from one platform to another?
That's right.
We should demand the right to self-governance.
Yeah.
You should get a say in the rules that control your experience. And we need these basic rights, and those are more important than whether or not you're using Mastodon or Blue Sky or Nostr or even Threads. You could use Threads as long as it upholds those rights.
I would go so far as to say, in order to achieve what you want, you have to have many people and it's like a whole ecosystem approach. If you just had one platform could not check all those boxes by definition.
Yeah.
So I think we really have to foster something bigger. And I think we have all the pieces we need, and people are doing it. We have great examples, and we just need to keep iterating. So I'm excited about that.
I'm incredibly excited. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for all of your work.
Sure.
And for taking the time to talk to me and for sharing it. Hope everyone checks out the Internet Exchange and the Social Web Foundation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it too.